I never thought I'd be standing across from my own parents in a courtroom, watching them eye my watch, my shoes, and even my laptop like vultures circling a fresh kill. But there we were, and honestly, was I wrong for pushing back as hard as I did? They were demanding every single thing I owned as repayment for my existence, and they actually thought the law was on their side. So I want you to tell me right now, if your own flesh and blood tried to strip you of everything you worked for just because they felt entitled to it, would you stay silent, or would you burn the bridges down? It all started about 3 years ago when I finally landed a high-paying job in tech after years of grinding through night shifts and living on ramen noodles. Growing up, my parents, Mark and Susan, were exactly the nurturing types. They viewed children as long-term financial investments rather than human beings, and they made sure I knew the cost of my upbringing from the moment I could count. On my 18th birthday, they didn't give me a cake. They gave me a spreadsheet detailing every cent they had spent on my food, clothing, and education since birth, telling me that eventually the bill would come due. I laughed it off at the time, thinking it was some twisted, dark joke. But as I became more successful, their demands became more frequent and much more aggressive. When I bought my first house, they didn't congratulate me. They asked where their consultation fee was for raising a son smart enough to afford a mortgage. Things reached a breaking point when my father lost his job due to his own ego, and instead of dipping into their healthy savings, they decided I was their personal ATM. They didn't just ask for a loan. They demanded I hand over the deed to my house so they could manage my assets, claiming I was too young to handle such responsibility. When I refused, the masks completely slipped, and the emotional blackmail turned into a legal nightmare. They hired a bottom-tier, aggressive lawyer who helped them file a lawsuit claiming that they had a verbal contract with me stating that all my future earnings and property belonged to the family estate in exchange for their support during my unproductive years. It sounded insane, and my lawyer told me it was a frivolous suit, but they were persistent, dragging me through months of depositions and stress, hoping I'd just settle to make them go away. They started showing up at my office, telling my coworkers I was an ungrateful son who was letting his parents starve, which was a blatant lie because they were still living in a 4-bedroom house and driving luxury cars. The tension built for months as we headed toward a final hearing to dismiss their claims, but they had a trick up their sleeve. They had forged documents, old contracts they claimed I signed when I was 19, that supposedly signed over my rights to any intellectual property or physical assets I acquired before the age of 30. It was a complete fabrication, but in the eyes of a busy court, it was enough to create a mess. On the day of the hearing, the atmosphere was suffocating. My mother sat there in her best Sunday dress, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief as if she were the victim, while my father stared me down with a look of pure, cold greed. Their lawyer was grandstanding, talking about the sanctity of the parental bond and the financial sacrifices made for my sake, while my own lawyer was readying a mountain of evidence to prove their claims were based on nothing but air. But then, things took a turn that nobody expected. My parents had filed a specific motion for an emergency, asset freeze, and an immediate inventory of my personal property, claiming I was hiding assets to avoid the repayment. They wanted the court to allow them to take possession of my electronics, my car, and my sentimental items right there, and then to satisfy what they called an equitable lien. It was the most humiliating moment of my life, sitting there while a judge listened to them argue that my very clothes belonged to them. So, that is the insane situation I was in, trapped between a legal system that moves slow and parents who move fast to ruin me, and I had to make a choice right there in that room. Before I tell you what happened when the bailiff stepped in and the truth finally exploded, I want you to pause and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have offered them a settlement just to get your life back, or would you have fought until there was nothing left? I decided to fight, and I decided to play their game better than they did. See, what my parents didn't know was that I had been recording our family meetings for years, including the one where my father laughed about how easy it would be to forge my signature on the very documents they just handed to the judge. As their lawyer finished his sob story, my attorney stood up and asked for a brief recess to present newly authenticated digital evidence that had just been processed. The judge looked annoyed, but he granted it. During that break, I saw my parents whispering, looking smug, thinking they had me cornered. When we returned, my lawyer didn't just talk, he played the audio. The entire courtroom heard my father's voice, clear as day, saying, "If we can just get the judge to believe he signed these papers back in college, we can take the house and the Tesla by the end of the month. He's a soft kid, he'll fold." The silence that followed was deafening. The judge's face went from bored to absolutely livid in a matter of seconds. My mother's fake tears dried up instantly, and my father turned a shade of gray I didn't know was possible for a living human. But the climax came when the judge turned to the bailiff. My parents, realizing the ship was sinking, actually tried to stand up and leave the courtroom, claiming my father was having a medical emergency. The bailiff, a massive guy who looked like he'd seen it all, didn't even have to move more than 2 steps. He just put his hand on his belt and said, "Sit down, now," in a voice that made the windows rattle. They both froze, literally paralyzed with fear, as the judge began to read them the riot act. He didn't just dismiss their case. He referred the matter to the district attorney for forgery and perjury. He looked at me with genuine sympathy and told my parents that they were a disgrace to the title of mother and father. In the aftermath, my parents were actually charged. They had to sell their house just to pay for their criminal defense and the massive legal fees they owed me after the judge ordered them to reimburse every cent I spent defending myself. They tried to call me, sending flying monkeys from the extended family to tell me that family doesn't sue family, but I blocked every single one of them. I changed my locks, moved to a new city, and finally felt the weight of that spreadsheet lift off my shoulders. They ended up in a small apartment, complaining to anyone who would listen about their cruel son, but the truth was finally out in the public record. Looking back, I realized that some people don't see their children as people, but as extensions of their own ego and bank accounts. Breaking free didn't just save my money, it saved my soul. If you ever find yourself being bled dry by people who claim to love you, remember that respect is earned, not inherited by blood. Like this video if you were on my side and think they got exactly what they deserved, and make sure to subscribe for more stories like this one where justice finally gets served. Share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. I'm curious if anyone else has dealt with family who acts more like a debt collection agency. I'll see you all in the next story.